Hi, this is Alan Chartock, and I'm delighted to be in conversation today with Claudia Coenen, a certified grief counselor and certified thanatologist. Claudia specializes in developing coping and processing strategies to help families and individuals through life's most challenging transitions. Claudia is the author of 2 books, Shattered by Grief, Picking Up the Pieces to Become Whole Again, and she has a new book being released July 1st called The Creative Toolkit. You can find out more about Claudia Coenen and her work at the KarunaProject.com. Welcome, Claudia.
Thank you, Alan.
Let me start by asking you, what is grief?
So grief is the holistic reaction to loss. Usually it's associated with the death of someone close. And what I mean by holistic is that it affects us on many different levels at the same time. We're affected emotionally, obviously. That's the most obvious one. We're affected cognitively, psychologically, spiritually, and also in our perception of our relationships and our community.
Well, so is it always the same for everybody?
No, it is not. There are certainly common themes, and many people will experience similar reactions. But our grief and our reactions to loss are very much affected by our attachment to the person that's gone or to the situation that we might be grieving. And also our culture, our family history, the way that we're used to expressing emotion, all of those things affect how we grieve.
Let me ask you a question. This is personal. What if you don't grieve, when you've experienced loss? What does it say about you?
Well, many people might suppress their grief and they may feel, oh, I'm not really grieving, and then it might come up later, or they may do things to distract themselves, like keeping really busy. There are other people who are not having a very strong reaction and they might think, oh, I'm not grieving. And that may be because the death was expected, or, for instance, I have a woman that I worked with for a little while whose husband was almost 100 years old when he died. And he had a very long life. He was actually a well-known artist. And I went to see her and she said, I think there's something wrong with me. I'm not feeling like I'm grieving. And I asked her what she meant. She said, well, she's not crying a lot, but she feels that he had a very full life. She, of course, misses him and she's lonely for him, but she wasn't experiencing what she expected in terms of her grief reaction. So I'm not sure that it's true that people don't grieve. If you cared about somebody or something, then you will experience grief, but you're going to experience it in different ways.
So how did you, Claudia Coenen, become an expert in grief? I mean, what makes you an expert?
Well, first, I experienced a devastating loss. In 2005, my husband died suddenly. And during that process of trying to pick myself up in what felt like the shattered pieces of my life, I went to what I know personally to do, which is creative process. And while I was doing that, I thought maybe I might be able to find a way to help other people through my own unique perspective. So I decided that I wanted to become a grief counselor, but I really didn't know how. And I also knew that I had only experienced kind of a very small slice of what grief feels like because I had experienced a sudden death. So I wanted to learn more. So I went back to school and I read a lot of books and I studied a lot with a lot of different people so that I could expand my knowledge of all the different ways that people grieve. So I got a master's in transpersonal psychology, which was not a grief program, but it was a holistic view of psychology. So I put every class sort of through the lens of how to become whole again after grief. And then I went to Brooklyn College to an advanced grief counseling certificate program and learned a lot about thanatology there. And then I'm also certified through a national organization, the Association of Death Education and Counseling. And that is primarily a group that supports counselors and also supports research into the field of thanatology, which is the study of death, dying, and bereavement. So I attend their conferences almost every year, and I usually am presenting there, and I learn a lot from my colleagues and from experts in the field.
First of all, I want to go back to your husband. How old was he when he died?
It was 4 days after his 50th birthday.
So in other words, he was a fairly young man, right?
Yes.
Does age have anything to do with levels of grief?
Well, I think it does. I think, when somebody, as I mentioned before, when somebody is elderly, my own father died in January, and I'm sad about that, but I'm also a little relieved that the quality of life that he had in the last couple of years was not particularly good. What he wasn't engaged in the things that he loved. So I'm not grieving that way as hard in any way that I was when my husband died suddenly. That was so totally unexpected. And it really felt like in the middle of our lives, in the middle of raising our children, that was just not supposed to happen. And it felt very unfair. So I was actually quite angry for a while.
We've all heard about Kubler-Ross and the stages of grief. What do you think of that?
I think that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is sort of the grandmother of talking about grief. She was the one that opened up the conversation about dying and said, we really need to be able to talk to people about it, because at the time when she was doing her research in the late 50s and early 60s, it was generally the thought in medical professions that you don't tell the person that they're dying, that would be a bad thing. So people were terminally ill, and they could tell that they could feel it, but nobody was talking to them about it. So there was a lot of sort of basic cover-up kind of a way of approaching it. And she opened that up. So she started people talking in realistic ways to people who are dying and to people who are grieving. The problem with Kubler-Ross's stages is that it's pretty much the only thing that the general population knows, and it's pretty much the only thing that's taught in therapy programs and in medical professionals when they're in their training. And it is a 50-year-old model, and even though Kubler-Ross herself did not prescribe it as the way to grieve, in fact, her model was based on how people were dying, the things that they were experiencing when they were dying, and then it was later added on to bereavement. It's been misinterpreted as if this is the way to do it. It goes in stages. You go through denial, bargaining, anger, depression, acceptance, and then you're done. And that is totally untrue. So one of the reasons that I wrote my new book is because I think that other professionals and also volunteers who are working with dying people and other people who are maybe starting peer support groups need to know more about the more current research models in grief. And so the first part of my book is that it's an overview of thanatology, of grief, of attachment theory, and several different models that are really useful and beneficial today.
So here we sit in the middle of probably the worst health crisis that this country has ever seen. First of all, do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
And your work, of course, is incredibly important, because if one person dies and you grieve, but we're having people dropping dead all over the place to the point where we're putting them in halls, we're putting them in trucks outside hospitals. Has that affected the way in which people are grieving?
Absolutely, it does. Two things. First of all, if you are already grieving in this time of coronavirus, grief often has an isolating quality to it where people sort of hunker down inside their emotions, and they're trying to grapple with all of those feelings. So they kind of feel cut off from other people to begin with. And now we're all cut off from each other. We're told to practice this thing that everybody's calling social distancing, which, by the way, I really don't like that term, because we do need to be physically distant, but we definitely need to remain socially connected. And I think we're also tuned into this collective grief that's everywhere. A lot of my clients say to me that they're feeling very alarmed, and they find themselves watching the news all the time. And I do too in some ways. And I think that there's this feeling like we're so out of control, we don't know what's happening, and it's so uncertain. And we want to find out, has anything changed? Do we have any more information? So we kind of find ourselves, going back and looking at the statistics and watching different news programs. And it's very arousing. We get very alarmed by that. Also, everybody is out there walking around with masks, if they are walking around, and people are feeling really anxious. And we're picking that up. And so I really think that we're in a time of collective grief as well.
How much does our grieving, our level of grief, have to do with our own sense of self?
I think it has a lot to do with your sense of self. And I think then that leads towards how are you resilient? Because if you have a rather amorphous sense of self and you feel you're very easily buffeted by the winds of change and by uncertainty and anxiety, it's harder for you to find a center place where you can kind of be calmer. It's hard for you to figure out ways to cope with these feelings that are being aroused around you. But if you have a stronger sense of self and you know that you have coping skills and you know that you are resilient, you might feel yourself to become agitated and anxious and sort of spinning around, but then you find a way to come back to yourself and find a way to calm yourself down so that you can cope in a better way.
So to what degree does, social class have to do with grief? Have you thought about that?
I think that sort of speaks to what I mentioned before, the word culture. Our families grow in a culture, in a way of being, whether it's informed by our spiritual beliefs or our ancestry. There are ways that people handle difficult situations. And I think that, probably social class feeds into that too. And of course, if you are on the poorer side and you don't have a lot of resources and you have to go and bag those groceries and you don't have a lot of of those resilient skills that I mentioned, and you don't have a lot of family support at home, perhaps there's a lot of people at home, perhaps there's a little bit of domestic violence at home, so it makes it really difficult, and it's harder to find a space within that to grieve when you're coping with all of these other things.
We're talking to Claudia Coenen, a creative grief counselor. What makes it creative in your title?
I tend to view things in a creative frame. When I was 15, I wrote in my diary that I wanted to live my life as creatively as possible. That was my life goal. And creativity and creative process could be anything. It could be making a collage of how you envision your future. But it also could just be that if you make a statement, oh, I'm having such a hard time today, don't think I can get through the day. And then you think, well, if I was on a desert island, I would be doing this. And that's like a creative reframe, So you can also take something really simple and just turn it around in a more creative way. And that's a different approach. What I also mean by being a creative grief counselor is that sometimes talking about your grief is very important, getting the words out. But one of my mentors in my graduate program said that language is a secondary way of communicating. And at first I was really appalled by that. I was like, oh, no, we talk to each other, we tell each other stories, that's how we communicate. And she asked me to think about it. And the fact is that we communicate how we feel and what we're thinking in a lot of other ways. There are visual cues, body language cues. We sense each other's emotions. And that is nonverbal. There's a lot of nonverbal ways of expressing how you feel. And I like to explore those with my clients.
So, Claudia Coenen, suppose I'm grieving. Suppose I have a terrible loss that I can't get over. Do I hire you and you help me?
I would hope so.
Okay. What will you do if I hire you?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would ask you on the phone, if you were to call me, I would ask you on the phone, to tell me a little bit about your situation and what it is that you're grieving. And I would listen very carefully to make sure that I feel like I'm the right person. Because if you call me and you are also experiencing a lot of other issues that perhaps are indicative of other types of mental illness, I might refer you to someone else, because that's not my area of expertise. But if it looks like it's pretty clear that there's grief, I might suggest that you can come in and do one session with me. And in that session, we'll both be able to tell whether it's a good fit. It's really important that you feel very comfortable with me, that you feel like you can open up, that you feel safe. Because if you don't feel safe and you don't feel like there's a rapport with me, then why even bother?
So what do you bring to it, Claudia, that a conventional psychologist or social worker would?
I bring a compassionate presence. No, I think conventional psychologists and social workers probably also bring compassionate presence. But my training is really in wanting to listen and encourage you to explore your own experience, to try to be a guide. One model, Dr. Alan Wolfelt, whose organization is called the Center for Loss and Life Transition. Dr. Alan Wolfelt has a view that we should be companions to people who are grieving. So the idea of I'm here, I have expertise in the field, but I'm not an expert in your experience. So I'm here to walk alongside you and to encourage you to explore your own experience. And then, of course, I have strategies and ideas that you might try. They might work. But I also, if I do offer something creative or something that's a little out of the box to my clients, I always tell them that it's offered in the spirit of wanting to help you. And if you don't like it or you don't feel like doing it, that's fine. Because you have to work through your own grief. So I'm there to help you, to offer some guidance, and also to just sort of sit back and listen.
Years and years ago, when I worked at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers, I had a secretary who was deeply in love with her husband, and he died, and she never, ever got over it. I talked to her on the phone, and she would begin to cry. And my question to you is, how common is that people can't ever stop grieving in a big way so that they can go on with their lives?
On the one hand, I would say grief never ends. I mean, I will always grieve Albie. I always will miss him, but I do not grieve in the same way that I did when he first died. So generally speaking, grief has a softening over time. And as you begin to re-engage in life and you begin to develop new interests and even new relationships, generally speaking, you do move in a more positive direction. So it isn't that common for someone to be crying and feeling that raw grief all the time, many, many years after a death.
Right.
That's usually an indicator that there's something else going on, or there are complicated grief situations that are also called prolonged grief disorder, and there are some new research methods and models to work with that. Personally, the DSM now has a prolonged grief disorder in its roster of psychological disorders, which is a bit problematic for most of us general grief counselors, because it sort of gives a time frame that if you're still that raw between 6 months and 1 year, then there's something wrong. And I don't really think that's true. I think in some cases, especially in the case of a sudden death or a really traumatic death, it probably takes a whole year to even cope with the fact that it's happened. So I don't like those artificial timelines. But I also don't know that it's true to say, oh, she hasn't gotten over it, or or what the other thing that you said, oh, I've never grieved. I think that we tend to apply these labels on top of things, and they're not always indicative of the truth.
Okay, well, I'm fascinated by what you're saying, and I should just point out that we're talking to Claudia Coenen, who is an expert on grief counseling and who has written extensively on it. I guess I want to ask you this. How much does one's individual guilt in life, if one tends to be a guilty person, play in the way in which they grieve?
It probably plays a lot. I don't like guilt very much, although it's very common. Guilt is one of those really sticky feelings that you can't do anything about. Because you can talk about, oh, if only I had done this, or if only that had happened, and what if this had happened, and what if the circumstances were different? And those are all, I think those are all reasonable things to explore, especially in early grief, because those questions do come up. But guilt usually is associated with helplessness, and if you can see it in that frame, then you see that there isn't anything that you can do that will change what has happened. Hopefully, I'm certainly going to try to help you let go of that guilt.
Well, okay. Do we know in advance? I've been married 49 years. Do we know in advance what our level of grief will be if we lose a partner?
Probably not. I think it's often very surprising. I think this woman who was telling me that she wasn't grieving her husband I think they've been married for 65 years. She was surprised by that. But I was able to reassure her that that's totally normal, and as long as she's still feeling connected to him and celebrating their relationship, then that's fine. That is the way that she's grieving. I don't know. I mean, I personally had thought that I would be widowed at some point, but I certainly expected to be well into my 70s before I was widowed. So it was a huge surprise. I had no idea how I was going to get through it.
You said sometimes there's something else going on. That caught my attention. I wonder what the something else's can be.
Well, there might be some other issues, like attachment issues, or perhaps this is a person who doesn't have a lot of other people in their lives, doesn't have any personal goals or hobbies or things that interest them, and they put all their focus on this one person, and they sort of don't have that strong sense of self. If everything is like they feel like their life is over because this person is gone. Now, that actually, people often feel that way in the beginning. They do feel like their life is over because they can't envision how their life might be without this important person. Mm-hmm. But one of the ways of getting through grief is to slowly begin to re-engage and to slowly begin to figure out what you would like to be engaged with and what you might want to do with your life. And another way to cope with your grief is to think about what you've learned from that person that you were in a relationship with, how you changed from being in that relationship, and consider the gifts in that, and then try to find ways that you can bring that forward into your own life in order to keep them there. I call my business the Karuna Project because my husband wrote that word on the top of all of his letters.
Interesting.
So every time I use that word, it's connected to him. But it also means an active compassion, and that is connected to wanting to help other people.
Well, what is Karuna?
Karuna is a Sanskrit word that means compassion in action.
Huh. So we are at a time now where obviously people who are dying cannot see their loved ones.
Yes, this is really challenging. It's really challenging, and it increases this feeling of not being able to grieve properly and not being able to comfort. I mean, people want to be at the bedside of somebody who's dying. They want to be able to hold their hand. They want to be able to kiss them. They want to be able to tell them how they feel, and they want to be able to hear their last words. And when you take that away from them, it's very, very activating, and people feel very upset by this. The funeral directors of our country, and probably of the world, and the religious leaders and many people in the end of life community are seriously talking about this. I'm part of a collective called the Virtual Funeral, where people are gathering to discuss ways to help families. And it's pretty much all gone virtual. Funeral directors are live streaming funerals. They're trying to make it possible for people to participate. They're developing family gatherings for shivas, for wakes, for mourning sessions with, where people can attend through Zoom or through other kind of virtual ways of meeting. But it's definitely problematic because not everybody can use the computer in that way.
Especially people who are of an older age.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So talk to me a little bit more about funerals. My mom did not want a funeral. Mm-hmm. She didn't want it. She was quite an accomplished woman. She got a lot done in her life. People adored her, but she wanted to be buried graveside. She didn't want anybody paying for it. And I've often wondered, and I've heard of that again and again, what is it that people eschew about having a funeral that affects people who could put a period at the end of a lifespan, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think this is another one of the challenges, because one of the things that a funeral service or even a celebration of life, because I'm with you, my family typically doesn't really do funerals, but we do like to have celebrations. But any kind of gathering that is there to commemorate the person who has died, whether it's a religious service that, a funeral mass or a service in a temple or a mosque, for people where that's comfortable, they need that. And one of the things that does for the family is it shows that other people were affected by this person who's died. Having people come and shake your hand or give you a hug and say, oh, he was such a wonderful person. Oh, she meant so much to me. I remember when she did this. That was so meaningful. That really helps the family. So these rituals, they provide a level of support and comfort to the family. And so how to create that in a virtual world is another really big challenge.
It's interesting that the person who has departed may have a great deal to do with the sense of grief that the people they left, I don't know if you're following me on this, have. In other words, you counsel people on their grief, but what happened previous to the person dying has a great deal to do with what we call grief or how we experience it.
Yeah, and that can be surprising too, because maybe the person who died was not nice. Maybe there was a really difficult relationship. Maybe they were violent or demeaning, or maybe you were divorced and now they're dead, and you're grieving that. It's complicated sometimes, but I think you still have the right to explore your grief and to express it, in whatever shape and form it might take.
No matter what, I think my mother, who, as I've said so many times, was so accomplished, I think she felt if she had a funeral, it wouldn't be enough. To celebrate what she had accomplished. I've seen that before. What do you think?
Everybody has their own view. I mean, we had a celebration of life for Albie. I didn't want to have a funeral. I didn't even want to have anything in the funeral home, but I was tipped off that his Catholic family really needed that, so we did have that for them. We had a celebration where we had all the music that he loved. We had words. Poetry that we both loved. We had food and a huge gathering. Over 400 people came. And I have a friend who's a playwright, and she scripted the ceremony for us. And I think this actually can feed into the idea of virtual celebrations, because one way that it really can work well is if it is organized well. So you have invited people to come and to speak, and they want to share stories of the person who's gone. But if you have it sort of arranged ahead of time, who's going when, and maybe have it interspersed with music or with words of comfort by specific people, it'll end up feeling more meaningful for everybody in that virtual setting.
You mentioned your husband's family's religion was Catholic, is that right?
Yes.
And you?
I'm culturally Jewish.
Culturally Jewish, got it. Believe me, I can understand that one.
And my father was born in Germany, so his family were atheists, but they were Jews, and they left Germany in 1939.
So how much does religion count in the way in which we grieve?
Well, it depends on each person. But if a family is or a person is religious and connected to their faith, then their faith might provide them with with methods to grieve, with religious support from their clergy. It might provide them with parables and adages that they can find in their religious texts. So it can help. But there's also something else that happens often, and this does happen with people who are deeply religious. Sometimes people have a crisis of faith when they lose somebody. They begin to question their faith, because that's sort of why me. I mean, when I worked in the hospice, we had a woman who was a deeply religious, very Catholic Irish woman. And she was a person who went to the church every day. She arranged the flowers. She was very closely connected with her church. And when her husband died, again, I think they'd been married for over 60 years, she suddenly stopped going to church. And she had never, ever done that in her life. And it was alarming to her, but she couldn't bring herself to go back for a long time. After several months, she finally went back. But she really felt very angry at God for taking her husband, and she just didn't want to walk into church. It's very individual.
Right, except that some funeral cultures are very different from others. I've gone to many Catholic masses for people who've passed. I'm, as you say, culturally Jewish. And I'm always surprised about how little is about the person who's died. Now, maybe that's just the ones I went to, but it seems to me that there are differences in the way in which different religions react to death.
I think there's different ways in which the services are structured. And when you attend a Catholic funeral, it is almost always a Catholic mass. So they're actually doing their regular mass, and then they're tacking on the funeral pieces. I know when my father-in-law's funeral mass happened, that was my first Catholic mass of a funeral nature. And I was also surprised by the same thing. There didn't seem to be as much. And our family members wanted to read certain things, and they were restricted in terms of what they could read. The priest told them they could read this or that, but not that. So, but that, everybody's different. And
So what could they do? Wait, let me interrupt, because I'm so fascinated by that. What could they do or not do, according to
I remember that there were certain religious texts that they could read, and there was a poem that my brother-in-law wanted to read, but he wasn't allowed to because it wasn't within that framework. They actually had a list of things that you could choose from, but they also allowed us to put music in, music of our own choice. And I was invited to sing a folk song, so I did. So that was part of it.
We, of course, are talking to Claudia Coenen, a creative grief counselor and certified thanatologist. Okay, so Claudia, my best friend died. He died, and I was working hard at the radio station, which I run, and I just couldn't get away. I had him on the radio twice for hour-long interviews. But he died, and his service was way out in Massachusetts on the islands, and I didn't go. And I felt a little guilty at the time. I thought I had celebrated him on the radio. Nevertheless, I felt a little guilty about that ever since. What do you make of that?
I think, that's a normal feeling. I think that you can do something about that if you like. You could, if you feel really strong guilt, and you wish that you had been there, or you wish that you could tell him that you wanted to be there, you could write him a letter and, let him know how you feel.
Well, he's dead.
Well, that's true, but if that's up to you. If you want to believe that he'll get it, then you can. This is something that you do for yourself. You can talk to him. I mean, I think that it's very common for people to talk to the people who are dead. I do it all the time.
I did it.
Many people do. Yes. You did not?
I did it with my father. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And I remember.
So did you question whether he heard you, or you just did it because it felt right?
No, I did it because it felt right. Quite strong. You were right about that. So, Claudia, what do we know in terms of the repercussions of grief? If you handle it right, it seems to me, you can go on with your life. Like my friend from New Jersey, she didn't get over it ever. And it really messed up her life. So the question is the importance of getting it right.
Yeah, I don't like that word, that there's a right, because that implies that there's a wrong way to do it. Grief is such a deep experience, and I think it's possible that if you're not moving through it, you may not be delving into it. It may be too scary for you
Yes.
to really plunge in. And I mean, it's something that you can titrate. You don't have to plunge all the way down and never come out, because I think there's also that fear. If I let myself go completely, I'm never going to come out. It's as if there's a giant abyss in front of you, and you're afraid that if you allow yourself to completely relax into the sadness, you're going to drown in that abyss.
You said you used the word titrate. Is that what you just said?
Yes, I did use that word. I mean, well, titrate like a dose. So you can decide, you can feel a wave of grief coming on, and you can say, I can't prevent this, and I don't think I need to prevent it. It'd be better for me to experience this. So I'm going to allow myself to completely fall apart for a period of time. I'm going to give myself a time limit, like 10 minutes on the clock. Here I go, and you just let yourself go, and you collapse on the floor, maybe you cry and you scream and you kick your feet like a little kid having a temper tantrum, or whatever you need to do, rocking back and forth and sobbing for about 10 minutes. And then when you get closer to the 10 minutes, you start to slow yourself down. You start to breathe deeply. You start to try to bring yourself out of it. And then at 10 minutes, you give yourself a big hug, congratulate yourself for a job well done. You just released a huge amount of emotion. Pick yourself up off the floor, go splash some water on your face, make yourself a cup of tea. That's titration.
You just mentioned children. I have 3 grandchildren, and one little boy is always fearful of when he hears that somebody has died. Are there ways to help children, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds grieve?
Absolutely. Is that how old he is?
Yes.
Yeah. He's coming to an awareness of impermanence, and that's very scary for him. Typically, children under the age of 7, when they hear about somebody dying, they might understand that they're not coming back, but they don't completely get that. And it's not unusual for a child that age, when somebody dies, for them to say, well, I know he's dead, but is he going to be here for Christmas? Because they don't quite get the permanence of it. But I think that children should be encouraged to explore their feelings. And they, again, with children in particular, working with nonverbal ways can be very helpful. They can, if they're very fearful about things that are happening externally, you could give this child a circle and ask them to draw the people that are important to them and the people that support them inside the circle, so they can see that there are helpers in their lives. There are a lot of ways that they can be encouraged to express their fears. And they also can write to that person or draw a picture for that person who's died. So say their grandmother died, and they wish that they could tell them something. I got a new truck, and I really wish I could tell my grandmother, so they could draw a picture of that truck.
Is there a way, Claudia, to help prepare? Now, here I am. I'm 78 years old. I'm going to die sooner or later. I've got a 5-year-old grandchild. Is there something I should be doing to help him previous to grief?
I don't know that you want to sit down and talk to him and say, someday, son, I'm going to die. I think that would be more scary than anything else. I think it's better to keep things in the here and now and in the present, to let that child know how much you care about them. And if you are in a position where you are ill and you know that you're dying, that might be a time to talk to them about how meaningful they are to your life, and how you hope they remember you in some ways. And but certainly not now. I wouldn't suggest that.
There's nothing that really can be done. So.
No, but I also think another thing that's important is that if the child expresses they're worried about people dying, to just ask them what they're worried about, and get that child to talk about it. Don't brush it off. Make it okay to talk about.
Gotcha.
In a matter-of-fact way, but let the child direct the conversation.
Okay, so you engage in something called transition counseling. What exactly is that?
Well, I think that's something that's very relevant right now. That I'm referring to the kind of losses that are more transitional than an actual death, like a job loss. Or my practice is in Hudson, and there are many people who have second homes up here, and then they decide that they don't want to live in Brooklyn anymore, or in the city, and they move up. And they think, oh, this is going to be great. I've moved up to my country house. And then they're completely at a loss. They've lost all of their social activities. They're not connecting with new people. They're sort of not really sure what they're doing in their lives. And sometimes that can trigger grief. And a lot of the time, those people have had losses in the past. So those are being triggered as well. So that's what I mean by transition counseling, that those points in our lives where we're really undergoing a big change, and we're finding ourselves having grief reactions to that.
Is that what you did? I mean, you lost your husband at a fairly early age. Did you move, or were you already here?
No, I was living in Stanfordville at the time, in Dutchess County, and I have a house there. And I made a decision. My children were 20, 17, and 14 at the time, and I didn't want to move. There was a certain point after a couple of years where I thought it would be wise to sell the house, but my children wouldn't hear of it. And I really felt that it was important for them to keep things as simple and as ordinary as possible, and not to make too many changes until they had, managed to get out through college. So I didn't move out of that house until all my children were graduated or well into college. So that was a choice that I made. It was maybe not the best financial choice because I still have the house. I just have it rented. I can't, it doesn't seem to sell at this moment. So, but that was a choice that I made. People say you shouldn't make major changes. Some people say in the first year, that part of that is because your mind isn't working very well. So it's hard to know how to make the right decision. For me, my focus was to try to figure out how to get myself through grief and to try to make sure that they stayed on the trajectories of their lives.
Claudia Coenen, so I guess the question is, do the circumstances of the death of the loved one affect the grieving process? What I mean by that is my father dropped dead. He did. Mm-hmm. And he was an older guy. I don't remember exactly how old he was, but he was older. He was close to 80. And my mother said to me, well, he had a cough and he went to the doctor and the doctor said it's just a cough and he dropped dead and I could sue the doctor. She said, but I'm not going to do that. That's a fairly common thing to hear, isn't it? That somebody could sue or some feelings of anger.
It's common feelings of anger for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so somebody drops dead on the street as opposed to somebody drops dead lying next to a partner. Those are differences in the way in which this stuff happens. Does that affect the grieving process, the circumstances of the death?
The circumstances definitely have an effect on the grieving process. And for each person, it's different. But for sure, a sudden death probably creates a longer period of shock because it was so unexpected than somebody who dies after a long illness, when you've been doing a lot of caregiving, or you have a diagnosis, that this person is terminal. You have a little bit more time to prepare and a little bit more time to engage in what we call anticipatory grief. However, there usually still will be some shock when that person dies. So it just, in my experience, I don't think it lasts as long when there's been an illness for a period of time.
Was your husband sick?
No, not at all.
He died of a heart attack?
He died of a heart attack, yeah. I left the room, I came back, and he took his last breath.
It's just unbelievable.
So, yeah.
I know that my parents, in those days, heart conditions were treated by putting a medicine of some kind under your tongue. I remember that. And I don't think that's the way we do it anymore. But one could almost see it coming if they wanted to see it coming. There's a question there somewhere.
So, you're talking about a person who has a heart condition and has been prescribed medication they can feel that something's coming on. Yeah, with heart attacks, the kind of heart attack that my husband had is called the widowmaker, and 75% of these first-time heart attacks are fatal. In retrospect, when we look at the autopsy results and we see that he had been a lifelong cigarette smoker,
And did you try to convince him not to?
Over and over again.
How does that figure into your grief process?
I was pretty angry about it. I was angry.
Yeah.
To me, it feels like it could have been avoided. And there's another sort of useless thought, because I might say, well, why didn't you stop smoking? But he was the one who would have had to have done that. And for whatever reason, he didn't. So, who can say? I certainly wish it hadn't happened, and it did.
Wow. So there is something called collective grief, and then there's personal grief. And what's the difference between the two of those?
Well, the collective grief is what I was speaking about before, that is the sense of all the grief that's out there in the world, all of, when we look at the statistics, this morning, it's over 21,000 people that have died in New York. Yeah. I mean, and that's so, I can't even wrap my mind around that. And, so when I think of that, I'm just filled with horror and with sadness for all of those people and all of those families. And I wish I could help them in some way, and I can't. So the fact that I can't contributes to my own personal grief, and what I'm feeling for all these other people that I've never even met is the collective grief.
Interesting. I've been very privileged to be allowed to interview Governor Andrew Cuomo on a regular basis. Point being that his relationship with his father is so compelling. I mean, the father really, Mario, really did set the standard for this kid's life. And not only did he compete with him, there's no question about that, but he also internalized, what would Papa have done? I can see it all the time. And, you know, it is just fascinating that the grief process becomes part of our, what Freud might have called character, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think that what we call continuing bonds, which is the way in which we remain connected to those people who have passed, that's an expression of that. The fact that Andrew thinks about what his father would have done, and then he makes a decision about whether he wants to do it the same way or do it differently, but it's still connected to his father. And that's an example of the continuing bond that he has with Mario.
Yeah, you know, it can get kind of complicated, can't it?
Yes, it can.
when you think of
I'll give you a funny example, because
Sure.
when Albie had very particular ways of doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had very particular ways of doing things, and he had a particular way to light the wood stoves. And he would always get angry at me because I did it very differently. I would just open up the bottom of the stove and, you know, make the flames go really high. And he was very cautious in that regard. And he would claim that I was about to set the house on fire. So after he died, I was having a very hard time getting the wood stoves burning. And I felt very incompetent and upset with myself that I couldn't do it the way he had told me I had to do it. And at one point, I filled the house with smoke. And at that moment, a friend of mine called, and I was crying. She said, "Claudia, what's wrong?" I said, "I can't make the fire. Albie said I had to do it like this, and I can't get it going." And she said, "Claudia, Albie doesn't get to have an opinion anymore." And I caught my breath and I started to laugh, because on the one hand, that was so sad. And on the other hand, it completely freed me from having to do it any other way. I could do it my way, and I wasn't going to set the house on fire. And I didn't set the house on fire, and I was able to get the stoves lit after that.
Well, to go back to the Mario example, which is very personal with me because I had a show for maybe 18 years with Mario Cuomo.
I remember listening to it.
And then Andrew comes along, and Andrew decides he's going to run for governor against Carl McCall, who had the nomination sewed up. He was the first African-American who would have had a chance at it. And I got furious. I said so on the radio, despite my relationship with Mario. And Mario got mad at me. He got really mad at me. I said, "You had to do it, didn't you?" And then Andrew gets elected governor, and Andrew doesn't come on to WAMC for 8 years. That's a long time. And then one day, there's a knock on the window, and there's our brilliant young news director, Ian Pickus, and he's mouthing the words, "Andrew wants to come on today for a half an hour." Well, he came on for a half an hour, and he came on for a half an hour for the next 50 weeks in a row. And so something within that particular post-Mario death relationship did something. It may be the fact that he knew that Mario had trusted me for all of those years. I don't know.
It's all part of the grief process.
Is it?
I think so. I think, you know, everybody grieves in their own way, and they sort of, how they foster relationships or stop relationships is affected by their grief as well. And, you know, obviously Andrew might have taken that personally for you, and then there's a certain point that sort of softened.
Yeah, or he might have been thinking, which I think he does a lot, what would Mario have wanted me to do?
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because Mario is so much a facet of his life. Now, you have kids, obviously, and you're a grief counselor. How have your kids gotten through all of this?
They've gotten through it amazingly well, and I think that they certainly didn't look to me for being their grief counselor, and I wasn't at the time. I wasn't a counselor at the time.
Right,
It has never been my role. I've encouraged them to find their own path and to find their own way through their experiences. They're all different in how much they share with me. And they've all been very, very successful in their lives. And I think, I'm not sure if they would agree with me, but I think that a lot of the choices that they've made in their lives have to do with their father, and they keep him. I know that they keep him alive in their lives. They feel very connected to him.
I don't want to violate any confidences, but the way that you came to this show is that our very good friend, our mutual friend, Malcolm Nance, said, "You got to get this lady on. She really knows what she's talking about." So my question to you is, how do you get your business?
So one of the prime ways I get business is that I have a listing with Psychology Today, and I get a lot of inquiries through that. So if you were to go online and look for grief counselor in Hudson, I would pop up. So people will then send me an email or give me a call. And then we'll, as I said before, we'll talk on the phone and see if I'm right for them, if they'd like to come in for a session. Right now, I am still seeing people. I'm seeing them on video. I'm not seeing people physically at the moment. Uh-huh. And in fact, I'm not even going to my office. I'm seeing people from the corner of my sitting room. So that's one way. And then there are some people will tell people if somebody's grieving, somebody might know about me, and they might say, oh, you should give Claudia a call because she helped me. So that's a word of mouth referral. There are some doctors in town who recommend me. And then sometimes through my organization, I get referrals.
So I guess the question is, what happens if somebody comes to you and as a grief counselor, you've been well recommended, but they have, as you said, other things involved. Mm-hmm. Could be guilt, could be other things, and it doesn't work. Do they ever hold it against you?
Not usually. Not usually. I have an agreement with them from the very beginning that if other issues arise that would be better held by a licensed therapist, then we're going to talk about that. And I might recommend that they go see a licensed therapist. Sometimes people come to me and they are already seeing a therapist. Right. So they might be seeing a therapist for other issues, and then they're coming to me for the grief. And in which case, we'll get a release so that we can share information if we need to, which we don't usually have to do that too much. But and then there have been a few occasions where it really seems very clear to me that they would be better helped by somebody else. And sometimes they can see that too. So then we just say, I wish them well, and I encourage them to get the help from the person that they want to get it from.
Well, let me ask you this, Claudia, as long as we're talking about this, you're obviously a woman. Do you get more women or men, or do you get both? Number one. And number two, the thing's complicated. I mean, in other words, part of grief is you don't have a sexual partner anymore sometimes. And obviously, you being a female may have a different perspective than a male might have.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that I can't listen to their perspective. I mean, we're humans and we have urges and needs, and I don't know that it's all that different. I mean, I try to be very careful with how I express myself, but I also want to make it safe for them to speak about anything that they're coming up with. And if you've lost your spouse, I mean, it's a huge problem, and there's actually a name for it. It's called skin hunger. You just miss that touch so much. And, it's important to respect and honor that and to try to help your client. I try to help my client figure out ways to deal with that, on their own. But in terms of male, female in my practice, it's typically thought that more women seek grief counseling than men, but I haven't found that to be the case. I have a pretty even balance of men and women.
Interesting. And is there any definitive thing you can tell us about the way in which males and females may approach grief?
I get asked this question a lot. There's some thought that men are more doers and women are more feelers, and that I haven't found that to be true. I think that we all have those differences within us where we engage in feeling and we engage in doing. And there's actually a grief model called the dual process model, where we go back and forth between the loss orientation, in which we're mourning and longing and wishing for that person, and then experiencing the grief and trying to figure out what it means in our lives. And then there's the doing, where we have to go to work and we have to get up and take a shower and we have to make dinner and we have to talk to our friends. And we actually fluctuate back and forth. The originators of the model called it oscillation, where we go back and forth between doing and feeling. And, certainly some people are more, active grievers. Ken Doka, a psychologist, calls that instrumental grief versus intuitive grief. And some people are pretty balanced. I go back and forth. I can do a lot of things with grief, but I also am comfortable with just feeling it. And I have male clients who are more feelers than doers, and I have women who are more active in keeping busy. So I don't know that it's so relevant to gender.
Huh. So if somebody is retired as opposed to still working, is that relevant to grief?
I think it depends. I mean, they may have more time to engage with it, which could be good, but it also could be problematic because they don't have enough to do to keep their mind occupied when they need to sort of put grief aside. Everybody's unique, Alan, and I like to just meet each person where they are and help them figure out their own process.
So I know people who have been married for a long, long time and who, lose a spouse and then they run from it. You don't see any real recognition of the former spouse. They get remarried and that kind of thing. What do you make of that?
I think it's a common thing that people do. And I think oftentimes, typically men do that faster than women do.
Why is
been
that?
proven. I think that some men, especially older men who have been married for a very long time, are very uncomfortable with being alone. They don't know how to do it. Whereas women are more comfortable staying in their emotional field. So they maybe are not so quick to repartner if they choose to. Also, if a person has been, male or female, if a person has been a very long-term caregiver for someone who's been ill for many, many years, it's very hard for them to consider the possibility of stepping into that again. Now that they're older and their potential new partner will also be older, and then they might be setting themselves up for another loss and another caregiving situation. And then some people really embrace that after a while. I knew that I would want to be in a relationship again, and I eventually engaged and, tried to put myself out there, and I got married again 5 years ago.
Wow. That's a very interesting facet of all of this. I've often wondered when a spouse tells a spouse, when you die, I'm going to find somebody else. I mean, it happens, just so you know. Is that a wise thing to do?
It doesn't sound very nice. I've actually heard it more the other way, that a spouse who knows that he or she is dying might encourage their spouse to find somebody else. I want you to find somebody else after I'm gone. And in fact, I had a client recently whose wife was ill for 10 years, and she was actively seeking another partner for him. She'd be like, well, what about her? What about that person? And he would say, no, don't, I don't want to talk about it. You're here. I want to be with you. And he did start dating after she died. But he was also very actively grieving. I mean, that's another thing that isn't well understood. And people who see a person dating early on or repartnering what you might consider is very soon after a loss, you don't really have insight into what that person's experience is. And just because they have decided to put themselves out there and try to be with other people and try to have a new relationship does not mean that they're not grieving. As a matter of fact, they may be holding both of those things and having a hard time with the dichotomy of being actively grieving and falling in love at the same time.
Does the new spouse have, in your mind, an obligation to help the surviving spouse, with their grief?
I don't know that they have an obligation, but they certainly should be understanding. Because if they're not, and if they think that you shouldn't ever mention that person again, then you probably shouldn't be in that relationship.
Interesting. Well, this has been fascinating. We've been talking with Claudia Coenen, a creative grief counselor, certified thanatologist, and author of Shattered by Grief, Picking Up the Pieces to Become Whole Again. And she has a new book being released July 1st called The Creative Toolkit. You can find out more at the karunaproject.com. That's karunaproject.com. Claudia, this has been terrific. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We so appreciate it.
Thank you, Alan.
You've been listening to Dr. Alan Chartock, President and CEO of WAMC Northeast Public Radio and Professor Emeritus at the University at Albany. For more information on WAMC's In Conversation with Alan series, or to order a physical copy, call 1-800-323-9262 or subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or on the Google Play Store.